All right. So this week is vacation week. It's also a week to be sick. How many of you have been sick somewhere in your family over the past couple weeks? It's really good to see you. I'm glad you found some health. You're able to join us. There seems a little more dangerous than other winters. Seems like when I'm out with people, I get a weird look. Like, have you been sick? And it's one I'm not used to, but the flu, the sickness has gone around to so many different families. It's been a difficult few weeks. But our sicknesses probably aren't the hardest thing that we've dealt with the past couple weeks. I didn't mention it last week, but I find myself now a week and a half later after the shooting in Florida, still thinking, still devastated by it all. And it seems like it's morphed from that grieving and sadness and the depth of it all into, I guess, what you would have guessed, the political spin of it all, depending where you are. And I found myself grieving the loss of grieving, I think, in it all. I found myself numb, angry, confused, pensive, and still grieving. And so I'm praying for those kids. I'm praying for those families. I'm praying for that community. And they're the ones that I think most people believe are going to lead the conversation of who are we as a nation and who will we become. And those are some pretty core questions that the kids are putting out to us. Who are we and who will we become? And then just this week, we lost someone that I think all of us have seen, looked ahead and said, man, that's going to be a great, terrible day when Billy Graham passes away. And Billy Graham went home to be with the Lord. And I find myself not asking at all who he is. I don't have any confusion over that man and where he stood. On the one hand is this, who are we and who will we become? And then on the other hand is, I know who he is, and I know what he's become. And I find it maybe somewhat interesting, maybe even amusing, when I read the folks who have been tweeting out about Billy Graham or the little articles around. It seems like he wanted people to be the best they could be. That's the message that I've been getting. I'm like, that's not the message I remember from Billy Graham. I remember a much clearer message. You can be the best that you can be in Jesus Christ, who forgives sins and opens the door of heaven for people like us. And there's hell and there's heaven, and God graciously has provided a pathway to heaven. And I remember Billy Graham being crystal clear on that and preaching that message that, yes, he wants us to be the best we can be, but not in a VeggieTale kind of way, in a very clear gospel biblical way. In fact, Billy Graham, he seemed like he knew what was coming. Maybe about a dozen years ago, he had this quote. He said, "The problems this world faces now are beyond human solutions. Only divine solutions exist for us now." I read that this week and thought, yep. Yep, the problems we're facing now, I think they're well past human solutions. But there's this divine presence, a divine intervention that has to happen to solve it. And so on one hand, I know who Billy Graham was. And on the other hand, I'm not so sure who we are. Which really, that's going to be the question we focus on today. We are moving through a series in Lent. I'm coming home. We're looking at stories of redemption. And this is our basic understanding. Redemption can be this church word that just kind of gets thrown out and, yeah, I think I'm supposed to like that. It's good. It's what Jesus did, but I don't know what it is. And we're kind of throwing back into some stories that God clearly shows us what this whole idea of redemption is and opens up his heart to us. In fact, during worship, sitting in the front, I get the privilege of seeing these banners. I found myself just taking it in. It's obvious, if you've heard this story even one time, that this is a father racing to meet his son who's come a long, winding journey home. And I found myself, God, thank you for being that kind of father who brings lost sons home. And that story will come from the pulpit in a couple of weeks. But we have this basic understanding of redemption, that in the culture of the Bible, those who found themselves outside the Father's household, it would have been their network, their extended family, their safety net, their security. That those who found themselves outside the Father's house, for whatever reason, whether it's their own decisions, whether it's outside forces, circumstances, whether it's an enemy that takes them, if you find yourself outside your Father's household, you find yourself outside society's normal circle of care and compassion and provision, protection. And so the patriarch of the father's house had this responsibility to go fetch the lost family member, the one who's left the clan, the one that's been stolen, the one the enemy has taken, the one who's been lost. The patriarch would take the role of the redeemer. I need to go find my lost son. I need to go find my stolen nephew. I need to bring my lost clan members home. In that process, the patriarch going out to find the lost member of his family and bringing them back into the father's household, that word that Israel's culture and the world around him used was redemption. You've been redeemed when you've been brought back to the father's household. And so the patriarch had that familial responsibility to rescue, to pay ransom, to bring back the lost family member, to redeem them back to the Father's house. And when I think about identity, so I've got 40 some odd years. Soon it will be 50 some odd years. But not yet. I'm holding off for a few more years of life and experiences. So some of you have 60, some of you maybe have 70, some of you have 20. But all of us have this wide range of experiences, things we've done, things we've accomplished. If I were to ask you, can you point to one defining thing that's either happened to you or that you've done that really has brought identity to you, would you point somewhere? So I went through my small story and thought, well, certainly my birth matters, right? But that's probably not my defining thing because all of us have that experience. I grew up in Nashua, spent most of my younger years there. When I was young, I made a decision to follow Jesus. And I thought, well, maybe that's my defining moment. But if I were to open up my story to you, that's a much broader narrative of God over my life. It wasn't just one prayer. It was God chasing me and bringing me back. And there were significant moments after college. Certainly following Jesus has been a strong definition. But for me, it's not the moment. That's a continuous kind of journey for me. So I went to Penn State for college. And I have all sorts of memories of Penn State, and I will publicly announce I'm thankful that those experiences at Penn State are not my identity any longer, because that would be very scary for me. Those are not defining moments for me, even though they were significant. And then my life takes me into marriage. Maybe marriage is your defining moment. That's the thing that you plant, your name, your reputation when you meet people. Maybe that's what you talk about. Certainly it could be. Or maybe almost 20 years ago, our church took a risk and brought me and my wife up. And FCCB has been an amazing influence on my life. You guys very much are a defining element to me on who I am. So I find myself introducing every so often as I'm a pastor. That's part of who I am. And then God has given us 3 kids. They certainly factor into who I am. Some of you will have markers of identity that I don't have. Maybe you're a veteran. And it doesn't take long in certain situations before you reveal the fact you're a veteran, because that's an important part of your identity. Maybe it's a degree you've earned or a particular accomplishment that you have. I wonder what the residual marker indicating some kind of important characteristic for you is. What you want to be known for. And here's what I find to be this amazing thing this morning. We can ask the same question of God. What is God's defining identity? How does God reveal himself to us? Is there something that God holds out in front of the whole world to see, to say, this is who I am? And in the pages of the Old Testament, we find it. And it's a very familiar phrase to us. How would God introduce himself to us? In the same way he has. And it's this: I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Do those words sound familiar to you? It's because they appear in the Old Testament hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. In my opinion, the God of the universe, the Creator God, does not need a historical event to define him. Like if God were to introduce himself to me, just I am Yahweh, just his presence, would be sufficient. But God takes this additional step to say, I'm the Lord your God, and then he presents this historical, significant event to define himself. I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Hundreds of times. I found it just in a quick search in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Nehemiah, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Haggai, Zechariah. That's not all the books of the Old Testament, but that's pretty close. That God introduces himself as the one who rescued his people from Egypt, the land of slavery. That's a story that we're going to drop into today. I was telling Rick this week that if God introduces himself as the God who saves his people from slavery hundreds of times, most of your Old Testament is the story of the Exodus and then the giving of the law, which is kind of wrapped up into one grand story. How can I ever preach it in 20 minutes? And so I just chose 2 verses. So you're getting 2 verses out of thousands. The story, the background for the Exodus is that God chooses Abram, a man who's walking faithfully before him, and he establishes a covenant with Abraham. And he says, your offspring is going to be great. You know all the sands on the seashore? Your offspring are going to outnumber them. The stars in the sky that are innumerable, so shall your offspring be, Abraham. I'm going to make you into a great nation. He promises, God does, that he will be their God. And Abraham gets old. His wife is super old. They still don't have a child. Abraham gets nervous. He takes a couple missteps and God still comes. He covenants again with him. No, God, Abraham, I will be faithful. And finally, in his old age, Abraham has a son. The story goes on. He has a son Isaac, who has a son Jacob, who has 12 sons, one of them being Joseph. Joseph is sold off by his brothers, who don't like the fact that Jacob prefers Joseph. They sell him off. They were going to kill him, but God saves his life, brings him to Egypt, where God miraculously brings him up to the number 2 man in Egypt under Pharaoh himself. So Joseph is in Egypt. His family is over in the land of Canaan, and a drought comes, and they begin to starve. And so they travel to Egypt, where they know they can find food, where this amazing story of Joseph introducing himself to his brothers occurs. And Joseph says, you meant this all for evil, but God meant it for good. And so his family travel up to Egypt. They move everyone up there, and thank you, Joseph, and they establish residency in Egypt. And Genesis ends with the story of God saving this covenant family through Joseph as they settle in Egypt. And then if we can have our first slide. Exodus, the very next book, opens up. Chapter 1. Now, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And then the music changes and the dark undertones begin. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. And the Egyptians put the Israelites now, rather than a treasured friend, they put them as slaves. They put them into hard labor. They enslave all the men. And Israel gets so large and is perceived to be such a threat to the kingdom of Egypt that the leaders in Egypt say, we've got to put an end to it. And they tell the midwives, if a girl is born, leave her. But if a boy is born to an Israelite, and the midwives, those of you who have had midwives, you know the story well, the midwives rise up and they say, no way, we're not killing the babies. And they tell the Pharaoh, man, these Israelites, they are so vigorous in labor, we can't do anything about it. And they save the boys. And so Pharaoh issues this new command, not just the midwives, but if there's any baby Israelite boys, throw them into the Nile. Kill them all. And it happens. Except for one Israelite boy named Moses, whose mom tucks him into a mini ark, is the word, and puts it onto the Nile, and the Egyptian princess finds Moses and raises Moses as her son. Exodus chapter 2. The story goes on. During this long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Hundreds of years. Can you imagine what that cry would have been like? It's not just a cry of, oh God, this is hard. It's a cry of generations now who have been enslaved, generations who have been abused, generations who feel like God has not come to meet them. They're in Egypt in the land of slavery, and now their baby boys are being murdered. That's an intense cry. In my picture, my imagination sees the moms of Israel screaming out together, and that cry ascending to the heavens, where God hears it, says, now's the time. Now's the time to do something. So God meets up with Moses. He sends a deliverer who's uniquely prepared and qualified to rescue the Israelites. And God's plan is to bring the Israelites home to the land that God promised. And he has this intimate moment. Chapter 4. These are the two verses for us. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, he's speaking to Moses, and God tells him, "Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me." Israel has never been called God's son prior to this. They've been a chosen people. They've been faithful. They've been a covenant people. They've been God's people. They've never been referred to as a son. But right here and right now, in this point of history, the patriarch is about to go fetch a group of people to bring them into his family so that they can be his sons. And the father says, "Israel, you are my firstborn son." And there's not a father on earth that wouldn't go to the ends to rescue his son from captivity, right? And we see the heart of the father beginning to beat here. Israel, my firstborn son. Pharaoh, I'm coming. I'm coming to redeem my son, to bring him home so that they can worship me. And so God calls them out. He rescues them in the most dramatic story of redemption that the world has ever seen. Millions, most people, the number lands between 1 and 2 million Israelites, leave the land of Egypt after all the plagues, after Pharaoh's firstborn son and the Egyptians' firstborn sons are killed. Israel leaves Egypt with all the plunder, with a pillar and a fire of God's presence before them. Like leading a victorious army when they were powerless to do anything on their own. God leads them out to prove to the world that Israel, his son, belonged to the Lord, not to Pharaoh. And that he, not Egypt's gods, was the Lord of the cosmos. And I love the fact that God personalizes this. He makes them sons. He brings them into his household, into the Father's house, the Beit Ab. So you can begin to see, right? Why does God identify himself with the Exodus, that he brought his people out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery so often? Because there's something about this that opens up God's heart to see who is our Father in the heavens. He's a redeemer. He's a patriarch who brings his sons home. And I want to invite you, turn to Exodus chapter 32. There's an interchange later in the story. God has done an amazing rescue. He knows that this will be his identifying experience to introduce himself to the world. And so he's giving Moses the law, which is part of this covenant back and forth. And Moses is up on the mountain. And listen to this interchange. Verse 1, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Who brought him up out of Egypt? Moses? Can you see the people forgetting already? It's been weeks, and the people are already forgetting this identifying marker that God was the one who rescued them. God was the Redeemer, and already they're saying Moses has brought us out. Verse 2, Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then feel the depth of this. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Can you feel the betrayal? Does that resonate deep within you? Where you want to be like Israel? How could you? No! God rescued you. God went to all the extents. He's your Redeemer. What are you doing? A golden calf brought you up out of Egypt? So when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day, people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in the revelry. And the scene shifts back up to the mountain. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. Can you feel his face turning away? They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. I've seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. O Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. And so the Lord relented, did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Why would this be so close to God's heart? Why would this be the defining accomplishment of God? God has a whole lot of possibilities to point to. Hey, I created the world. Hey, look what I did. I made a man and a woman. I'm in charge of a heavenly host. Look at the miracles I've done. But of all the things that God could have pointed to, he points to this one act, and it is obviously close to his heart. That I redeemed my people out of slavery. I brought them up out of Egypt. In fact, at our Life Together meals, sometimes on a Sunday morning, we'll have a testimony, a chance for one of us to share a story of what God is doing. And typically, it's a story about, well, when I was in college, a friend of mine who was close to me kept inviting me to Bible studies, and I said, no. But finally I went, and God did something in my heart that day. I was introduced to a Savior named Jesus. And through the sharing and teaching of His Word and the love of that community, my life was changed. I was a wreck. And then God saved me in Jesus. And we hear that kind of testimony often. If you are an Israelite, or if you are an active Jew today participating in Passover, your testimony is, I was a wreck. I was powerless to save myself. I was in bondage. I was without value until the day that Yahweh found me. He heard my cry. He remembered His covenant, and He delivered me out of slavery and set me free. For the Jews, even today, and we remember it in our communion meal, they identify still as if God delivered them personally from bondage. They repeat the verbiage to bring them back to Egypt to remember the deliverance of that incredible redemption. Jews still identify with the Exodus today because the patriarch has come to redeem his clan. So why does God identify himself with this? Here's what I think. That God would undertake yet a bigger rescue mission with a greater Moses to free an even greater number of people to make them sons forever. And it would cost God his own firstborn, Jesus, to do so. And yet, in the laying down of his own life, Jesus set those who follow him free forever. And in that redemption story, an even greater Passover, with Jesus on a cross dying to set his people free, we begin to hear, perhaps with a new sound, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. In fact, John chapter 8, if we can put our verse up, Jesus replies, I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, oh man, you are free indeed. You are truly in the Father's household. You are a son. In Colossians 1, a verse we're going to see often through Lent. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. God's rescue mission doesn't end in Egypt. It begins with delivering his people, calling them his sons, giving them the promised land in the Father's household forever. But today, God's redemption is for you and I. That we were slaves. We were powerless to do anything to save ourselves. But a Father in heaven, who is a Redeemer God, has come and has given his own firstborn Son so that you and I might experience freedom as sons forever. And his mechanism? It's not Moses the deliverer. It's faith in Jesus the deliverer. That in faith in Jesus, our bondage is freed. Our sins are paid for. And into all of eternity with God is offered. And the invitation is sitting right there. To come home. To follow Jesus out of your life of slavery. That redemption is accomplished for you. That the doors of your Father's house are opened for you. And there is room in the Father's house, even for you. He is the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the kingdom of darkness, out of the land of slavery. And for those of us who have known this redeeming God, who have chosen to follow Jesus, who have responded to his knock on our door, we have this wild celebration that we have a Father who's come and brought us home. 1 Peter chapter 2. We'll end with this verse. FCCB, if you're walking with the Lord, if you've given your life and declared Jesus to be Lord of the universe, if you know him as your Redeemer, your Rescuer, the one who has come to save, here's a passage for you. FCCB, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. For once you were not a people, you were just a band of people enslaved. But now, you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. God freed his people Israel out of Egypt for the purpose that they could worship him. God frees us in Jesus for the same purpose, that our hearts would be free to worship, that our hearts would be free to follow, that our hearts would be free to declare the praises of the one who came to rescue. We're going to give you the opportunity to do just that as we invite you forward to communion during our song, to worship a God who continues to rescue people like me and people like you. You are welcome to come forward to communion whenever you're ready. The song will play for quite a while, so there's no particular rush. But as you come home to the communion table, you're coming home to the body and the blood of Jesus. You're coming home to the one who laid himself down for you. Bruce Decker and I will be up front to serve you. If I can invite the worship team up and close in prayer. Father, I thank you for your heart. I thank you that you're not a God that we don't know. I thank you that you're not a God who hasn't revealed yourself to us. But God, you've spoken so clearly that you have a father's heart. And you have gone to all the extents and laid down what was most important to you. That you gave your firstborn son, that he might die on a cross, that the world might know you and be saved. God, thank you for rescuing us. Thank you for invading my story and calling me to your household. I thank you for the testimony of faithful followers of Jesus throughout the world, throughout the ages, who all proclaim with one voice, God, you are worthy of our praise. You are the one who rescues. You alone deserve glory and honor and praise for all generations until we see you face to face. God, thank you for the story of redemption. And thank you for the greater redemption you've offered in Jesus. God, may you be pleased at our hearts as we come forward to eat and to drink the body and the blood of he who died for us. God, thank you for your grace and your mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.